Database Systems. Introduction to Databases and Data Warehouses, Edition 2.0. Welcome to Chapter 3, Relational Database Modeling. Once database requirements are collected and visualized as a conceptual database model, the next step in creating a database is to convert the conceptual model into a logical database model. A relational database model is a logical database model that represents a database as a collection of related tables. A relational schema is a visual depiction of the relational database model. Most contemporary commercial DBMS software packages are relational DBMS, RDBMS software packages, and most professional databases are implemented as relational databases. Several synonyms are routinely used with relational databases. A table is also referred to as a relation or a relational table. A column of a table is also known as an attribute or a field. A row of a table is also known as a record or a tuple. A relation is a table containing rows and columns, and it is the main construct in the relational database model. Every relation is a table, but not every table is a relation. In order for a table to be a relational table, the following conditions must hold. Within one table, each column must have a unique name. Within one table, each row must be unique. All values in each column must be from the same predefined domain. Within each row, each value in each column must be single-valued. Only one value from a predefined domain can be placed within each row in each column. Here we see an example of a relational table and of a table that is not a relational table. As an exercise, in the bottom table, identify every instance of non-compliance with the relational table rules we just introduced. These instances are listed on page 64. Within relational tables, the order of columns is irrelevant, and the order of rows is irrelevant. Here we see an example of the same relation with rows and columns appearing in a different order. The important thing to note is that changing the order of columns or changing the order of rows does not change the relational table. This allows for sorting and unsorting rows and columns of relational tables. A relational database is a collection of related relations within which each relation has a unique name. A primary key is a column or a set of columns whose value is unique for each row. Each relation must have a primary key. When relations are depicted, in each relation, the name of the primary key column is underlined in order to distinguish it from the other columns in the relation. Here we see a relation with 5 columns, where the primary column Employee ID is underlined. Note that all values in the column Employee ID are unique. Once an ER diagram is constructed, it is subsequently mapped into a relational schema. A relational schema visually depicts a collection of related relations that form a relational database. In this chapter, we will discuss in detail the rules of mapping ER diagrams into relational schemas. We will start with the rules for mapping entities into relations. Each regular entity becomes a relation, and each regular attribute of a regular entity becomes a column of the newly created relation. If an entity has a single unique attribute, then that attribute becomes the primary key in the resulting mapped relation. In the top part of this slide, we see how an entity with 4 attributes is mapped as a relational table with 4 columns. A unique attribute was mapped as a primary key. In the bottom part of the slide, we see the mapped relational table populated with sample data. If an entity has a composite attribute, each component of a composite attribute is mapped as a column of a relation. The composite attribute itself does not appear in the mapped relation. In the top part of this slide, we see how an entity with a composite attribute is mapped as a relational table. Note that each component of a composite attribute is mapped as a column of a relation, but the composite attribute itself does not appear in the mapped relation. In the bottom part of the slide, we see the mapped relation table populated with sample data. The composite attribute does not appear in the mapped relation. However, when the mapped relation is presented to a user in a front-end application, the composite attribute is clearly indicated to the user, as shown in this example. A composite primary key is a primary key that is composed of multiple columns. Column names of a composite primary key are underlined because combined together they form the primary key. It is important to note that every relation has only one primary key. Therefore, if more than one column of a relation is underlined, that never indicates more than one primary key. When more than one column of a relation is underlined, the underlined columns form a composite primary key. An entity whose only unique attribute is a composite attribute is mapped as a relation with a composite primary key. Here we see an entity with a unique composite attribute mapped into a relation, and the sample data records for the mapped relation. Note that neither building nor room number are unique, but their combination is. An optional attribute of an entity is mapped as an optional column. In this example, note that the optional column bonus in the table employee mapped from the optional attribute bonus in the entity employee does not have to have a value in each row. Entity integrity constraint is a relational database rule mandating that no primary key column can have null, empty values. Every RDBMS enforces this rule. On the left, we see an example of compliance with the entity integrity constraint, as all rows have a value in the primary key column. On the right, we see an example of violation of the entity integrity constraint, as not all rows have a value in the primary key column. The table on the right would not be permitted by an RDBMS. Here we see another entity integrity constraint compliance and violation example. Note that entity integrity constraint is applicable on all components of the composite primary key. The table on the right would not be permitted by an RDBMS.